That's 150 years ago. This area where you are sitting right now was actually a farm. Detroit ended about 5 blocks away. The city stopped, and this was considered the country. Now, a bunch of people were getting a little tired of living in the city. Most people at the time lived up and down the river because they needed the river for work and to move things back and forth. And, of course, they needed the river to get water from. In the old days, believe it or not, you could actually drink the water in the Detroit River. I don't recommend we do that anymore, right? Now we just turn on the tap. People started moving out here into the country. And there was a man who did that named Henry Porter Baldwin. Now, Henry Porter Baldwin owned a company that sold shoes and other things, but mostly shoes. He built a house out here where the highway is now. And he decided that he was getting a little tired of going all the way down to the river to go to church. I know it doesn't seem very far for us now, but in the old days, they had to go by horse. There were no cars. So he called a meeting of a bunch of his neighbors who had also built a few houses around here. And he said, boy, do I have a deal for you. You know that piece of land over there on the corner of Woodward? And, you ready for this? High Street? That's what this street where the freeway is now used to be called High Street. He said, a couple of months ago, I bought that farm. And if all of us can get together and raise some money, I will give that piece of land and we can build a church. 2 weeks later, they met again, actually met twice in that time period. And on December 27, 1858, they had everything they needed, people and money, to build St. John's Church. Matter of fact, the reason why it's called St. John's is because on our calendar, December 27th is the Feast of St. John. Now, Henry Porter Baldwin was an interesting guy. He had actually been very involved in politics in addition to having crops or having his business. And he was very active in the 1850s and the early 1860s trying to get somebody elected president. Who wants to take a guess who that was? Who became president in the 1860s? Well, President Obama, who just became president. That's right. George, now we're in between George Washington and Barack Obama. Abraham Lincoln. Henry Porter Baldwin was very involved in helping to form a political party that helped to elect Abraham Lincoln. As a matter of fact, Henry Porter Baldwin later went on to be a congressman, and he was governor of Michigan. So that's pretty impressive. He felt that those things were very important. Now, to give you a very quick, interesting history, because there are really a couple things about this that are pretty interesting. First of all, the building you're sitting in is our second building. Our first building behind you. Maybe you go back downstairs and go away. They can see it. Yeah, we're not this up. You'll see, we actually have another church right behind this one. That's our original building. That's the first building they built. And by the time they finished it, it was too small. It only seats 125 people. So they decided in 1859, after they opened that building, that they needed to build a bigger building. And that's the building you're sitting in right now. So you all have heard of the Civil War, right? Right? Abraham Lincoln was very important in our American history. And the Civil War, this building opened the year that the Civil War started. How do you like that for how long it's been that this building's been open right here? But there's something else very amazing about this big building. This big building was moved. Could you imagine trying to move a building this big? Who can imagine that? Can you imagine that? They actually decided that the street out here, Woodward Avenue, was too small. It used to be very narrow. And the state of Michigan said, Woodward bigger. And so the people at St. John said, that's fine, move our church. And the city did that. Now, there's another church right over here called Central Methodist. Central Methodist decided that they weren't going to move their whole church, and they actually took a slice of the building right near the front, and they knocked it down, and they moved the front of the building backwards and just made the building smaller. Well, you know what? The time that they were doing this, they needed every seat they could possibly have here, because this was a very large congregation. And so they had, from the state, some money. They first went back and forth and figured out how much that would cost. They dug a big hole underneath the building and put the building on railroad tracks. They actually built railroad tracks underneath the building. And then they dug a big hole behind the building. And they made a new basement. They poured cement and got a new basement built. And then in one day, they took the bell tower, the big tower down, they took that apart. And they put the rocks over here on the racks. And then in one day, with steam shovels and trucks and people stood down next to the tracks and literally pushed. They moved this building in 24 hours. They moved it back 60 feet. How far is 60 feet? Well, if you were standing out on Woodward today, in the left turn lane, in the lane where you turn to go left, in the middle of the road, that's where the front steps of this big building used to be. 40 million pounds. That's how much this building weighs. And they were able to move it backwards onto a new foundation. So, it really is pretty amazing. So think about it. Remember what this neighborhood looked like when it was farmland? Well, soon after that, everybody started moving out here. They started building big, huge church houses over here in the neighborhoods. Anybody have seen any of those big houses over there? Some of them they fixed up real fancy, and some of them don't look so good, right? Well, they built those. And then they started building businesses, shops, and offices around the church. Then they built something across the street in 1928. You can tell me what big building got built across the street in 1928. Anybody want to take a guess? Somebody say it. The Fox Theater. They built that in 1928. See, all of a sudden, this neighborhood, in that short time period of 60 years, went from being a country to being in the middle of a big city. And St. John's has had all sorts of wonderful challenges on how to be a church that's not out in the country, but is involved in all sorts of things in the middle of the city. During World War II, which happened in the 1940s, we used to have another big building, which we've since taken down, where we used to put soldiers up so the soldiers could stay there. We used to have a lunchroom for people to come and eat. We used to have a gym. Nowadays, of course, we have our big room underneath here because you're here to eat lunch, right? It's a nice big space. We have all sorts of meetings that happen here and education events. And of course, we have church, which is the main reason that we're here. We have beautiful services on Sunday. So really, St. John's has had all sorts of wonderful, exciting opportunities